Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. How you doing, Mouin?
Very well. Thank you, Nassim. Always a pleasure and hope you're well too.
And I'm glad to see you back in Canada. Last week, our conversation was from Amsterdam,
That's right.
which is your home city, I guess. We will
The
speak
Hague,
about
actually.
Hague, yes. We will return to that right at the end of our conversation, but we will begin as we usually do with updates from the developments from Gaza,
Mhm.
and we'll look at some of the new revelations exposing holes in the Israeli narrative around 7th of October. There's been a number of stories over the past week or so exposing how there's been miscommunication, maybe willfully so. So we will look at that as well. Fresh allegations of sexual abuse of Palestinian detainees. In this case, a very prominent, well-known Palestinian doctor from Gaza, Adnan al-Bursh. I want to get your thoughts on the turmoil at the ICC, International Criminal Court, update on that. And then we'll finish off with a discussion about Trump's new appointments and also the latest from what is now clearly a scandal from regarding the Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters in Amsterdam. New revelations have come out showing that, of course, we knew, and it clearly wasn't a pogrom as was claimed, and now the mayor of Amsterdam has waded in and regrets her description of the events and said a number of things which we take note of
Yeah.
and get more
After the
thoughts on.
damage has been done.
Yes, that's right, as is usually the case. But let's begin as we normally do with developments in Gaza. The UN Special Committee, one of the UN Special Committee has now waded in, reached a conclusion that what they see in Gaza is characteristic of genocide. And added to that, the Pope also waded in last week, saying that he wanted to see an investigation into whether Israel is committing genocide. So there seems to be, a coalescing of key individuals, major institutions around the world, who are all reaching the conclusion that what Israel is doing is a genocide.
Yeah. Well, of course, any discussion of genocide has been primarily focused on the International Court of Justice, which in January ruled that South Africa had presented a plausible case against Israel and that it will now go to a full hearing. And that case is not expected to conclude for a number of years. But in the meantime, it's becoming increasingly clear that one doesn't need a formal determination by the International Court of Justice to draw conclusions about what Israel is actually doing in the Gaza Strip. A growing number of genocide scholars, of human rights organizations, of various UN bodies are increasingly concluding that it can already be determined that Israel is engaging in genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. This latest report you mentioned, it's by the UN Special Committee on Israeli Practices Affecting the Territories Occupied in 1967. That's roughly its name. And this was a report, and this is a committee that was established by the UN General Assembly in 1968 to periodically report on the human rights situation in the occupied Arab territories. So, not only the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, and until 1980-81, also the Israeli, what was then the Israeli occupied Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. And in its latest report, issued earlier this week, it once again goes through the various increasingly severe and serious human rights violations that Israel is perpetrating against the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip, and concludes that basically this has all the hallmarks of genocide, because again, genocide has a very clear and specific legal definition. And this committee, which I may have neglected to mention before, is composed of Malaysia, Senegal, and Sri Lanka. They were appointed for this role by the UN General Assembly, and this is a committee, by the way, that since 1968 has never been granted permission by Israel to visit the occupied territories concerned. So it relies on all kinds of indirect testimony, field visits, to meet with victims of human rights abuses in third countries, and the reports of other specialists and so on, and has now quite clearly concluded that Israeli conduct in the Gaza Strip has all the hallmarks of genocide. And I'm sorry, but you also asked me about another report.
No, I mentioned Francis that
Oh, sorry. Yes.
he
Oh,
also
yeah.
called for an investigation. Of
Yeah.
course, he's
I
not
mean,
making a
for
determination. Sorry, go on.
yes, for a person of the stature of the Pope to come out and make a statement that whether or not genocide is occurring in the Gaza Strip is something that needs to be investigated. I mean, someone like the Pope does not make statements like this lightly, given his stature and the sensitivity of his position and so on. But for him to even say that this needs to be investigated is, in my view, a polite way of saying there's an ongoing genocide and it needs to stop. If he had even the slightest doubt that this was not a genocide, I can't imagine he would have even raised the issue in public comments.
No, I think I mean I agree with you there completely. I mean
Mm.
it's not usual for the Pope to intervene in such matters, but he has done so in this case. And also, of course, Human Rights Watch publishes a number of reports, and they've also published one last week. I think it's called "Hopeless, Starving, and Besieged," and the conclusion they're reaching basically is what we've been discussing over the last many months, that Israel is forcefully expelling Palestinians from northern Gaza, and there is an ethnic cleansing. They don't use the word genocide. Maybe you can explain why, but they do say there is a clear ethnic cleansing going on in Gaza. So even if you don't agree to the genocide term, there's of course war crimes, crimes against humanity, which organizations like Human Rights Watch have been documenting now and have reached a determination that that is the case.
Yeah, I mean, this is another interesting report. Human Rights Watch has generally been very slow to come out with determinations about the key issues. I think it was only 2 or 3 years ago that it finally concluded that Israel is an apartheid state, for example. And in this case, I think it wanted to focus on a specific issue in a specific area of the Gaza Strip, the northern Gaza Strip, and the issue of forced displacement. So that may be another reason why it didn't engage with the question of genocide as such. I suspect that's something that Human Rights Watch is examining as we speak, and hopefully their determination on the matter and their report on it will be available before the International Court of Justice concludes its hearings. But I think this is an important report because many people who perhaps haven't been following this issue very closely and hear reports that Israel is basically ordering civilians to leave the Gaza Strip, identifying safe routes through which they should evacuate the northern Gaza Strip, and then also assigning destinations of where people should be going, may conclude, well, what more could these people ask for? They're being warned ahead of time, they're being provided safe passage, and they're being provided refuge in a safe destination. And I think what this report demonstrates very clearly is that kind of thoroughly contradicts the reality. What Israel has done is impose a comprehensive siege on the Gaza Strip. And we've spoken about this in recent weeks, not allowing any humanitarian aid or vital supplies in. And it's been bombing and sniping and killing people who attempt to escape, and then for good measure, also bombing and killing them when they reach these areas of safe refuge. And we've all seen the news reports during the past week. Dozens of civilians are being bombed and shelled on a daily basis in this area concerned. Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, and Jabalia refugee camp, and Jabalia municipality. And it's really, I mean, it can only be described as a war of annihilation. But again, what Human Rights Watch focuses on is the issue of forced displacement. In other words, are these people simply being provided with the opportunity to take temporary refuge in a safe zone until the conclusion of hostilities, at which point they will be allowed to safely return? And I think this report shows quite clearly that Israel is forcibly expelling the population through these kinds of siege tactics and indiscriminate terror bombings. And it's then going in and systematically destroying every structure in these areas, reducing them to rubble so that these people have nothing to return to. And for good measure, Israeli public officials and military officers entirely confident that they can do whatever they want and say whatever they want with total impunity because they will never be held to account for their actions, are now openly stating that those residents who have been forcibly displaced, in other words, those who have been expelled, will never be allowed to return. And this raises another issue that I don't think is treated in the report, which is that Israel intends to indefinitely occupy this territory. And this then ties into another discussion about growing demands from the Israeli far right to reestablish Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip that were removed in 2005. And of course, you look at Israel's current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He was he was one of the leading opponents of the so-called disengagement plan in 2005. And his coalition partners have been calling to reestablish these settlements virtually since October 7th.
Mm. On that note, I was reading a piece in the Haaretz, I think it was a few days ago, on the very issue of the Israeli mindset at the moment, the general mindset. On the one hand, the public will roil at the idea or push back, Biden, the idea that Israel is committing genocide. And then if you ask them, so what should be done with the Palestinians in Gaza? They say, well, they should be expelled. They should be removed from Gaza. So there's a real disconnect between what their heart really is seeking and what they're unwilling to accept. Everyone knows what they're actually calling for is genocide, is ethnic cleansing. But when you put a mirror in front of them and say, this is exactly what you're saying. So no, we're not doing that. We can't be doing that. It's a strange phenomenon. And
I mean, yeah, there wasn't a Nakba, but we want another one is kind of the line. If I can just make one last point on this Human Rights Watch report and the issue of forcible displacement and ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing, of course, comprises two components. The first is the forcible displacement, in other words, the expulsion. And the second one, which is just as important, is preventing those who have been forcibly displaced from returning to their homes. And it's only when you have those two elements together, getting rid of people and making sure they don't or can't come back, that you can speak of ethnic cleansing. This, of course, is what happened in 1948, and this is what's happening now in the northern Gaza Strip.
Let's turn our attention to another big story from Israel about 7 October. There's lots of new revelations about exactly what happened. I mean, I remember within 2 months, I think it was December, the New York Times published an article saying that Israeli officials obtained battle plans, Hamas's battle plans about exactly what they were going to do. And that was within 2 months of 7 October. Now, slowly, there are more and more revelations. The latest ones expose huge gaps and holes in the Israeli narrative. In one of the Israeli sources, it says that Netanyahu knew 4 hours before Hamas attacked on 7 October, but he did nothing about it. So do you want to just unpack some of the new revelations, which shows a huge gap and holes in the Israeli narrative about exactly what happened on 7 October?
Well, there's several separate issues here, and let me start by saying I'm generally skeptical of these reports that Israel had the information at its disposal and could have prevented the Hamas attacks of October 7th had it wanted to. I'm sure there was some information coming from low-level conscripts on the Gaza border and so on, but the idea that October 7th happened because all the information was there, but people responsible for these issues didn't have the capacity to connect the dots is I think, a quite significant exaggeration. I remain convinced that Israel had very little information at its disposal. It certainly didn't have this detailed battle plan that the New York Times has been writing about, which I question whether one even existed. And to the extent that Israel finally realized what was imminent, I think that information became available too late in the day for Israel, under the circumstances, to properly mobilize and stop it. So, having said that, I think we need to see these revelations in the context of the war of all against all within Israel, between the government and the security establishment, within the government, within the security establishment, the army and the intelligence services, and so on. And in terms of, everyone trying to put forward the claim that others were in a position to stop October 7th, but it was them who failed, not us. And so these latest revelations, I really do think, fit into that general pattern. But what we're now being told is that there's several issues. The first is that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's military secretary, I believe it was, he was ordered, or he arranged for the minutes of prime ministerial meetings and cabinet meetings to be altered in a way that to demonstrate that the government had less knowledge than was available to it at the time. Now, two things can be true. The government did not have sufficient information, but the government is also trying to doctor the documents to show that even what little information it did have at its disposal really wasn't there, in order basically to protect itself from opposition and from eventual accountability for its failures on October 7th. There's a second, and I think much more interesting, set of revelations regarding the ceasefire negotiations. I don't know if you want me to get into these now, or whether...
Yes, I mean, we did speak about that a while back, the leaking of information to Bild and
Yes.
Jewish Chronicle. But yeah, provide us further updates
Well,
on that.
the second set of revelations is, I think, much more relevant politically to what is happening now, and basically the allegations are that there were people within the Israeli intelligence services who were leaking information to Netanyahu, one of Netanyahu's press secretaries, I believe it was, one of his close people in his entourage. This is a far-right figure who didn't have proper security clearance. And this individual was then doctoring and leaking these reports to, let's call them, reliable and compliant media, primarily the Jewish Chronicle in the United Kingdom and the Bild in Germany. And the story that was being put out was that the Hamas leader at the time, Yahya Sinwar, was opposed to a ceasefire agreement because he was convinced that the longer the war went on, the greater the possibility that Hamas's coalition partners in the axis of resistance would escalate. And therefore, he had absolutely no intention of reaching a ceasefire. And this was clearly a false picture, and it was meant to kind of present Netanyahu to those members of the Israeli public and more broadly internationally who wanted to see these negotiations be taken seriously and succeed, that it wasn't him who was undermining and sabotaging them, but rather that it was Hamas. And then these revelations were also used, and this is the issue that's now really getting a lot of attention in Israel, to kind of delegitimize, if you will, the families and friends of the Israeli captives and hostages in Gaza by trying to present their protests as something that was strengthening the hand of Hamas in relation to the efforts of the Israeli government to achieve a proper ceasefire agreement. And that's what's causing the current scandal. And that's why there are now several people in Netanyahu's entourage and in the intelligence services, either in prison or under interrogation.
Mm. This is this does speak to a mindset within the Israelis. I mean, if you look at historically, that you can chart this mindset. The two-state solution, for example, Israel was never really interested in peace. Its expansionist goal had always taken priority over peace, any kind of negotiation, which is why Netanyahu, for example, propped up Hamas in the way he did over many decades, because having no peace serves its expansionist goal. And I think this is a similar mindset where finding any means possible to not have any ceasefire agreement allows Israel to continue the war. So this speaks to, and I think, an ongoing
Yes.
psychology within the Israelis that, peace does not really serve our expansionist goal. Ceasefire does not serve our interest in occupying, taking control of Gaza and dealing with what they see as the Gaza problem.
That's right, and the additional element of it is not just the Israeli policies that you described, but getting Israel's adversaries to be the ones to take responsibility for Israel's policies. In other words, rather than Israel not wanting a ceasefire, it now becomes Hamas which is rejecting one, even though, of course, we all know that Hamas had already accepted the plan or the initiative that was on the table. And here one also needs to bring in the role of the United States, where, every so often, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is trotted out to basically say Netanyahu's right, Israel's working very hard to achieve an agreement, but it's only because of Hamas that we haven't reached one yet. And I mean, we could have known even without these revelations that Blinken is lying through his teeth, but he performs this function at kind of regular intervals in order to insulate Netanyahu from any criticism, including growing criticism in the United States.
Let's turn our attention to Dr. Adnan al-Bursh. Really harrowing details have emerged of his murder, his killing. So the Israelis likely, as is the case, seems to be the case, that they sexually abused him before he was killed. Sky News did a report on him. He was naked. He was found naked. A prison guard threw him in the middle of the yard and let him die. I mean, this is a kind of confirms what many have seen over the past year. The harrowing incident in Settlement detention center as well, where Palestinians were raped, and this seems to, now there's evidence to suggest that this is almost systemic. There is ongoing rape of Palestinian detainees. In this case, Dr. Adnan al-Bursh.
Yeah, it's as you said, it's a harrowing, it's a very harrowing story. So Dr. Adnan al-Bursh was one of the most prominent health workers in the Gaza Strip. He was, I believe, head of the pediatric section at Al Shifa Hospital. And when Israel attacked Al Shifa Hospital in November of last year, he moved to what was known as the Indonesian Hospital to continue his work there. Then later moved to Al Auda Hospital in the north of the West Bank. And when Israel attacked Al Auda as well, at a certain point, they made an announcement that all males between 18 and 65 had to leave the hospital and surrender, including, of course, all the medical staff. And if they didn't, Israel would bomb the hospital, including all those patients and other civilians inside it. So Dr. Ed Bush, along with the others, surrendered themselves. This is in still in November of last year. He was taken to the notorious torture and rape center, Sde Teman, in southern Israel, where he appears to have suffered horrific torture and abuse and most likely gang rape as well. And in April of this year, he was moved to Ofer prison in the West Bank, just outside the city of Ramallah, where fellow prisoners on during his final days, they said he appeared to have broken ribs, was incapable of using the bathroom unassisted, and they found him naked from the waist down in the yard of this prison where the Israeli prison staff had obviously just thrown him out and left him to die. His fellow prisoners brought him inside, and a few minutes later he passed away. And this story is now coming out because of new information that's being made available by several of those who were imprisoned with Dr. Ed Bush and who were now telling their story. And as you mentioned, it has appeared on Sky News. My understanding is that the Israeli authorities also have yet to release Dr. Ed Bush's corpse so that a proper autopsy can be conducted. And I don't think we need to wonder for very long about why that might be the case.
Let's discuss now some of the protests that's been happening in Israel against the war efforts. We spoke about Yoav Gallant. One of the reasons Yoav Gallant, the former military defense minister, one of the reasons he was sacked was because he wanted to conscript the Haredi Jewish community, the Orthodox Haredi Jewish community. His replacement has not rescinded Gallant's order to have members of the Haredi community conscripted. Israel needs something like 10,000 new soldiers for its campaigns in Lebanon and Gaza and elsewhere. And there's been a lot of protest within Israel. So let's speak about that also within the context of the fact that the war effort I shouldn't say war effort, the aggression in Lebanon is also not going as planned. There's been a lot of missile strikes in Israel from Lebanon by Hezbollah. And at the same time, you have Israel needing, as has been reported, 10,000 new soldiers, and the Haredi community, from whom Israel is looking to for more soldiers, is protesting. They don't want to take part in the military campaign. And so far, there's something like only 1,000 have been conscripted, which is not nowhere near what Israel needs at the moment.
Yes, I mean, the Israeli government is in a very difficult position. It's already fighting at least a two-front war. It's a war that's been going on now for some 400 days, which is turning into the longest war in Israel's history. Israel's Israel's military casualties are mounting between dead, wounded, immobilized through PTSD, and so on. And, we're not talking about Russia or China or the United States here. Israel has a significant manpower challenge and needs to replace those who are no longer able to serve because they're dead or wounded or immobilized with new recruits. And the most important source of new recruits would be this Haredi community who have traditionally been given draft exemptions on the grounds that they contribute to the security of the Jewish people through religious study. And that's an arrangement that worked fine when the size of this community was somewhat limited, but it's not only become an increasing proportion of Israeli society, but its participation in the military effort is because of the context also much more needed now. So the government is caught between a rock and a hard place. If it insists on proceeding with the conscription of these people, the government will fall because the religious parties who are part of the governments of Netanyahu's coalition won't accept it. And they've made very clear that this for them is a core non negotiable issue. But at the same time, if the government renounces their conscription through new parliamentary legislation, there's going to be growing polarization within Israeli society, particularly reservists who are either having to serve several tours of duty or who are leaving the country because they don't want to do this anymore or who are not reporting for duty. So, either way, whatever decision the government makes, it's going to be facing significant problems. My suspicion is that at the end of the day, and given the history here, that and Netanyahu will find a way to extend the exemption of Haredi youth from conscription, and that'll certainly keep the Orthodox religious parties on board. But it's going to create problems for him elsewhere, particularly if he can't get enough members of his own Likud party to support such legislation in parliament.
Hmm. I remember reading a piece from an Israeli source saying that as many as 600,000 Israelis have left the country, and those that have left, they you'd assume they are more liberal, quote unquote. If they can, they've gone to the US or other parts of Europe, and eventually the direction of travel for Israel is further and further to the right. The only people that will remain within Israel are the you know extremists, the settlers, and these people are not inclined to have any kind of peace or compromise with the Palestinians. So I think you're probably right. Netanyahu probably thinks he can protect the Haredi
Finesse.
community. Yeah,
Mhm.
he can do that.
Mhm.
But let's go to our next story, which is the ICC, the turmoil within the ICC. I want to quote something Karim Khan said when he issued the request for the arrest warrant. He said that, I insist that all attempts to impede, intimidate, or improperly influence the officials of this court must cease immediately. My office will not hesitate to act pursuant to Article 70 of the Rome Statute if such conduct continues. I mean, the question now, given we've spoken about this before, the allegations against Karim Khan that suddenly appeared, and also now the US applying pressure. Just today, I read a tweet from a Republican politician in the US saying that if the ICC does not withdraw or reverse its course, they will impose sanctions on the ICC. Those threats are already coming. So, do you think he can stay true to his word when he issued the arrest request for the arrest warrants many months back, that the ICC will not be intimidated and it will will not be intimidated by any coercion or campaign to influence its decision?
No, I don't. And it's quite clear that Khan and the ICC more generally have already been intimidated and have allowed themselves to be intimidated because we've all seen the revelations, we've all read the reports. You and I know exactly what's going on. And how has the ICC responded? Mute silence. We haven't seen any indictments or arrest warrants for those who we know, as we speak, are working around the clock to interfere with the administration of justice by the International Criminal Court. And they're not doing anything about it, nor do I expect that they will. In terms of this investigation against Karim Khan for sexual harassment or abuse and this harassment of one of his colleagues, irrespective of the validity of the allegations against him, it's quite clear that this investigation is also a shot across the bow directed at the judges, the three judges that constitute the pretrial chamber, who will ultimately have to make a decision on the prosecutor's application for arrest warrants. One of them has already pleaded an unspecified illness and left. And I suspect the others are now very intimidated a half a year on, and they still can't bring it within themselves to take a decision on what was a very simple request. Here are the accusations against Netanyahu and Gallant. Should we or should we not issue an arrest warrant? The problem is, if they issue an arrest warrant, the ICC is finished. And if they don't issue an arrest warrant, or they choose not to issue an arrest warrant, the ICC is also finished. And what we've seen during the past half year are these constant efforts to kick the can forward to avoid taking a decision in the hope that there is some kind of divine intervention that saves the ICC from having to make a decision on this issue. And regarding Karim Khan, the story keeps getting more complicated. First, he is accused of sexual harassment of abusing his authority also with respect to a colleague who actually did not request an investigation, but then an investigation is started anyway. And now it turns out that Karim Khan's wife has a role in this agency, the Office of Internal Oversight Services, which is responsible for the investigation. And what we see is almost every week a new layer of complication, whose purpose is not to uncover the truth about these allegations against Karim Khan, or to provide justice to those he's accused of abusing, but it's simply to paralyze the work of the International Criminal Court to make sure that, were it so inclined, it won't move forward with these cases against the Israeli Prime Minister and his former defense minister.
And if we were to see all that within the context of what we've been reading over the past few months, the revelations by The Guardian, a number of other news agencies, about intimidation against officials in the ICC by Mossad and other Israeli officials, given also that this alleged victim did not want an investigation, you have to also ask, is there also inducements going on, not just intimidation, but also inducement to pursue a course, So I wouldn't, of course, we don't have any evidence, we can only speculate, but I think if we know what Israel is capable of and what has been doing with the ICC over the past many years, I think you'll have to ask, has there been inducement of this specific alleged victim?
Yeah. And when it no longer matters, we'll find out.
Yeah. Last week, we spoke briefly about Trump's victory. That was before Trump appointed his Israeli first, let's just say, cabinet. Many if you listen to some of their views, especially the person he's appointed to be the US envoy to Israel, he doesn't even believe in the Palestinians. He doesn't believe Israel is occupying the West Bank. So when you have people in your cabinet like that, you can only assume. I wrote a piece for Memo saying that the Trump's philosophy of peace, well, it's not Trump's philosophy, but his the pillar of his foreign policy, as his supporters will say, peace through strength doctrine, that can only serve Jewish supremacy. That's the way I look at it. If you look at the people he surrounded himself with, we will see Jewish supremacy, the likes of Smotrich, Ben Gvir being empowered, and their vision of Israel, which is Greater Israel, expanding all the way to the Jordan River, being created.
Yeah, I mean, you look at this rogues gallery Trump has appointed as his cabinet, and you can only conclude, well, if this bunch doesn't run at Washington into the ground, nothing will. And then you look at his foreign policy picks, and you mentioned Mike Huckabee, who's been nominated to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. My understanding is this position has now also been raised to a cabinet level position. And Huckabee, he's kind of the perfect counterpart to Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich. In his view, Palestinians don't exist. Um, Palestinians don't exist. The West Bank is not occupied. It's not even called the West Bank. It's really Judea and Samaria. It was promised to Israel by God because, of course, the Bible is a land deed and God is a real estate agent, and on and on and on. So my view is, yes, these are fanatically radical extremist views, but there's also, I think, some benefit in the clarity, because if you look at what Huckabee is proposing, it's effectively what the US has been doing for decades. And it would be nice for a change to have US officials who say the quiet part out loud, who directly say what their policy is, instead of, as we've had with previous administrations, of saying one thing and doing the opposite. So we'll if these new cabinet picks are given the leeway to implement foreign policy as they see fit, will U.S. Middle East policy go into a more radical and extreme direction than it already has? Probably. But at the same time, let's not fool ourselves. It's not as if, if once Trump assumes office, we're going to face the threat of genocide. We've been facing the reality of genocide for over a year under the stewardship of the Democrats, of Biden and the person, the Democrat who hoped to replace him, Harris. So let's not exaggerate the differences too much, and pretend that U.S. Middle East policy has been all that different from the kinds of things Trump's nominees are now saying out loud.
Yeah, and if the unspeakable has happened, how much worse can it get? That's the calculation many will make, and I'm sure many voters who chose not to vote for the Democrats said, I mean, okay, we'll hedge our bets with Trump, and take the flip of the coin over the certainty of your ongoing support for
Well,
genocide. So yeah.
yeah, my understanding is that it's not so much that people switched to Trump, but that so many people stayed home or decided not to participate in these elections, that even with fewer votes than he received in 2020, Trump still managed to win the popular vote in addition to the Electoral College vote. So you have, and it's really amazing, that so many people who, unlike in 2016 or 2020, knew exactly what the alternative to Harris would be, but simply couldn't bring themselves to vote for Harris in the full knowledge of what the alternative was. That's how bad of a candidate she was. And that's how horrid of a campaign the Democrats ran. Was it all about Gaza? Of course not. The margin of victory is too large to put it down to a single issue. But did Gaza play a role? Apparently it did, and not only among Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, because the anti-genocide constituency appears to be far broader than these two identity-based constituencies.
I think you're right. We can overplay Trump's victory, and his supporters, of course, know that will want to do that and claim that they have a huge mandate. But the facts are 70 million Americans didn't vote. Trump won something like 70 million votes, and just under 70 million went to Harris. So there's 70 million votes to play for, and this idea this somehow equals to a huge mandate to do whatever he wants is I think is not founded on facts. But on the US, I'm wondering, we saw Biden do something which many did not anticipate, which is to allow Ukraine to use US missiles in an offensive way to strike Russia. So do you think there's a possibility that Biden may, attempt at one last swipe, a feeble gesture to do something, tie Trump's hand? Because I think that Obama tried something, didn't he, before he left, and Trump came in 2016. I'm speaking about UN Resolution 2334, where US abstained and resolution passed 14-0, saying that the settlements are a violation of international law. Of course, that sounds like basic. It's not really a key issue in the sense that that's the bare minimum. But the US abstained, and that signaled to the Americans. I'm sorry, to Israel, that yes, this resolution has been passed and universally condemned the illegal settlements in the West Bank. So do you think, Biden could do something similar as a gesture, as a last swipe against Trump before Trump comes in? Because he's done that with Ukraine. So maybe he could do something. What could he do in that kind of, if he wanted to do something? So
that's entirely possible. The more likely scenario, although I wouldn't necessarily consider it very likely, is that Trump has apparently communicated to Netanyahu that he doesn't want to assume office and step right into a escalating war in the Middle East. And this is understood to mean that Trump wants Israel to end its invasion of Lebanon before the 20th of January. But should Biden be so inclined, there's all kinds of things he can do, and particularly if he wants to complicate the beginning of the Trump presidency, he can, together with Israel, upset the apple cart with respect to Iran, and that might also be in Israel's interest, because I think that from Israel's point of view, what they can do while Biden is in office will be much more constrained once Trump is in the White House, even with these extremists running foreign policy that we just discussed, because despite his radical instincts and so on, Trump is apparently also not too keen to get the United States involved in another Middle East war. And of course, a war with Iran would make Iraq look like child's play.
Let's end with the unfolding events from Amsterdam. We spoke about it last week, and you were in Holland last week. And this just recently, the mayor of Amsterdam, let me get her name right, Femke Halsema. She said something really extraordinary. She gave an interview and she said that she regretted using the word pogrom. And then she went on to say, and I quote, "We were completely overtaken by Israel." So remember, Netanyahu was saying that there's a pogrom going on, and that led everything. And then soon as Netanyahu described it as such, as a pogrom, it's as if every single Western leader had to repeat those words. They came out condemning the pogroms, um, Biden to Starmer, and also this mayor of Amsterdam. So, what's the latest update from Amsterdam to completely debunk what has been a massive scandal and a failure by the mainstream media to paint the aggressors, known aggressors, they're known for their racism and anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian hostility and racism, paint them as the victims. And now it turns out that really the reality is, as many suspected, that the media and our politicians got this absolutely wrong. And this will be presented as a case study of how badly wrong they were.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, this is a woman who's the former leader of the Dutch Green Left Party, basically parroting what Netanyahu was saying, and with absolutely no self-awareness, saying, "Yeah, I said it because Netanyahu said it, and with hindsight, I was wrong." Well, it's too little, too late. All the damage has already been done. And very few people are even going to be aware that she's now withdrawn these outrageous accusations that she made last week. Now she's also saying that she should have spoken out more in defense of her own citizens, the residents of the city where she is mayor, and particularly the Moroccan community, because these were being attacked by Israeli thugs. But it's taken her a whole week to realize that this Israeli mob was assaulting her own residents. Only now she can say something publicly about it. I mean, the this really of all the scandals we've seen during the past year with respect to how politicians and the media have responded to events. I think this is really on an entirely different level. Yes, unlike what we've been seeing in the Gaza Strip, no one was killed, but the level of obfuscation, the level of falsification, the level of deliberate, premeditated distortion in this story has really been on an entirely new level. We also have now, to give an example, a Dutch minister of Moroccan origin resigned from the government without saying so, but it appears there was a cabinet meeting in which he participated, in which all kinds of racist statements were being made by Dutch cabinet ministers. And on that basis, she resigned. And then the prime minister comes out and he says, "There is no racism in my government, and there is no racism in any of the parties that form the coalition." Well, the head of the main party in that coalition, Geert Wilders, was actually convicted by a Dutch court of discrimination and will be going to the West Bank next month at the invitation of one of these extreme settler groups to visit West Bank, illegal West Bank settlements. And this guy, the prime minister, is saying with a straight face there's no racism. Well, he can only say that because most likely he does not consider these statements that are being made by himself and by his ministers against Dutch citizens of Moroccan background or of the Islamic faith. He probably considers these statements to be accurate rather than racist.
And one wonders, though, given how easily they parroted Netanyahu's line about it being a pogrom, that say, I don't see this as being um, pie in the sky or impossible. Imagine a scenario where Israel considers some of the activists in Europe as being terrorists, and it carries out Munich-style assassinations. I'm not sure whether the presidents and the prime ministers, heads of states, will actually go out and condemn it in the way they should be and defend their citizens against Israeli assault and murder and kidnapping, if Israel so wish to do that. If we see how broad their definition of terrorism is, they'll define any opposition to Israel as being a terrorist act. And if they cannot stop this through legal means, and if there was a scenario where Israel carried out an assassination of a British citizen or a Dutch citizen or a French citizen, I wonder if those governments will push back and say, no, we will protect our citizens against Israeli assassinations. And it's worth thinking about that,
Well,
given.
yes, it is worth thinking about because we already know from what happened in Amsterdam last week that the entire Dutch political class is prepared to demonize and denounce their own citizens in defense of a gang of rampaging Israeli thugs. None of these people spoke out in defense of their citizens or against these thugs. It was quite the opposite. They were denouncing their own citizens and describing what happened to these thugs as a pogrom, as if and having speaking of pogroms, I mean, a core element of any pogrom is a position of the authorities and the role that the police play. Well, in this case, there was a pro-Palestinian demonstration the next day, illegal because all demonstrations had been declared illegal, and a bunch of demonstrators were taken by the police and beaten to a pulp in a distant field. Can you imagine the response if this would have happened to the Israeli thugs because of their attacks on residents of Amsterdam? It would be all over the news.
Mm. And I think it's an important distinction you make between pogroms and riots. You can say it's a riot. Pogrom requires police and military officials, security officials to actually
Yes.
carry out the killing and the murder, which wasn't the case.
Yes.
Anyhow, I mean, we may come back to this,
I'm
no
afraid we
doubt.
will.
Yeah. As ever, Mouin, it was pleasure talking to you.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
joining us, and thank you also for tuning into our weekly review with me, Nassim Ahmed and Mouin Rabbani. Bye bye.